There is a version of Final Fantasy VII that Square never made, never approved, and almost certainly never wanted to exist. It runs on 8-bit hardware and was sold in countries that had a fairly relaxed attitude towards intellectual property law, and it was built by a group of Chinese developers who looked at one of the most ambitious and era-defining RPGs ever created, a game so vast it shipped across 3 separate PlayStation discs, and decided that the correct response was to jam the whole thing onto a Nintendo cart and sell it for a profit. What makes this genuinely surreal is that this isn't some tongue-in-cheek parody or a fan-made curiosity buried on a forum somewhere. It is a fully realised, commercially distributed product that people could walk into a shop and buy. This is a game that sincerely tried to recreate the scope, characters and story beats of Final Fantasy VII on hardware that, quite frankly, had no business even attempting it. The sheer audacity of it borders on unbelievable because this isn't a case of cutting corners or simplifying a concept for fun. It is a direct attempt to brute force one of the most technically ambitious games of its generation onto a system that predates it by over a decade, and somehow, against all logic, it actually functions. So, let's talk about how on earth this thing exists. I am Lady Arcade, and if you love nostalgia, hit that subscribe button. It's time to talk about the entirely unauthorized 8-bit demake of one of the most sacred titles in gaming history. This is the story of the NES version of Final Fantasy VII. Released in January 1997 in Japan and September 1997 in the West, Final Fantasy VII was the game that changed everything. It was a game that did not just sell well, it defined a generation of players and made the PlayStation the console to own. It was so large, in fact, that a Nintendo 64 cartridge could never have housed it, which is a significant part of why it ended up on Sony's platform to begin with, a decision that shifted the balance of the console war considerably. The game is, by almost any measure, one of the most important pieces of software ever released. Which makes what happened in 2005 all the more bizarre. Because in 2005, 8 years after Final Fantasy VII's original PlayStation release, a Chinese company called Shenzhen Nanjing Technology released an unauthorized 8-bit demake of the game for Famiclone hardware. Famiclones, for anyone who needs the context, were unlicensed clone consoles built to run NES and Famicom cartridges. They were manufactured primarily in Taiwan and mainland China and sold across large parts of the world where copyright enforcement was either minimal or simply non-existent. In those markets, unofficial software was not a niche curiosity, it was often just how gaming worked. And Shenzhen Nanjing Technology knew that market very well indeed. If you have spent any time in the world of Chinese bootleg cartridges, and not in a flattering way, this is the company responsible for an enormous proportion of counterfeit Pokemon cartridges that have flooded the second-hand market over the years. The fake copies of Gold, Silver, Ruby and Sapphire that generations of unsuspecting buyers have purchased online only to find their save data vanishing after a few hours. If you have ever bought a suspiciously cheap Pokemon game and had your heart broken by a corrupted save, there is a reasonable chance Shenzhen Nanjing was somewhere in the supply chain. Their standard approach was to lift graphical assets and music from existing games and repurpose them into new releases with minimal original content. It was a profitable model and it required relatively little technical ambition. Final Fantasy VII, however, represented something different, something considerably more ambitious than anything they had attempted before. The cartridge the game was sold on carried the title Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, a name shared with the feature-length CG film sequel to the original game that was released in Japanese cinemas in September 2005. Whether the game was developed specifically to capitalise on the film's release, or whether it had been in development earlier and was simply rebranded for the occasion, it's not entirely clear. But what is clear is that the title screen of the game itself drops the Advent Children subtitle entirely and presents the game simply as Final Fantasy VII, which tells you something about the relationship between the packaging and the actual product. What Shenzhen Nanjing had actually produced was a full 8-bit demake of the PlayStation Classic, not a rough approximation, not a game that's borrowed the name and slapped a few familiar sprites together, a genuine, structured attempt to retell the story and recreate the systems of Final Fantasy VII on hardware operating under a tiny fraction of the original's technical capabilities. That is either impressive or deranged, depending on how generously you want to read it. Possibly both. In a rather ambitious turn of events, those working at the company opted to make this an overhead 8-bit retelling of the full PlayStation game. Like the original, the game sees the player directing Cloud Strife through a huge world utilising a party of 3 interchangeable members. Players can explore towns, speak to NPCs, navigate dungeons, and engage in turn-based battles. The first act takes place in Midgar, exactly as in the original, and from there the world map opens up, with further towns, caves, and locations becoming accessible as players reach the world map. The world map itself functions in a broadly familiar way, with areas blocked off by water, mountains, and geographical obstacles that can be overcome through the use of chocobos or motorized vehicles as the player progresses. Random encounters trigger battles throughout, and victories award experience points and gil, which can be spent in the game's shops. It's worth noting that a Materia system is also present, though it functions differently from the PlayStation original. In the NES version, Materia can only be used a limited number of times before it must be recharged at magic shops. Using the same Materia repeatedly in a battle does still cause it to grow more powerful over time, which is a detail that maintains at least some of the connection to the original game's progression systems. It is a simplified interpretation, but the fact that it exists at all on this hardware is genuinely notable. As for the visual approach, Shenzhen Nanjing deployed many of the same techniques used by other Famiclone developers of the era. A significant portion of the graphical assets were borrowed from Final Fantasy games on the Super Nintendo, specifically Final Fantasy III, and other entries in the SNES library, converted to 4-color palettes and placed into the NES game. It is not original artwork, and it's not subtle about the fact, but the result is a game that has a coherent visual identity and is considerably more polished looking than you might expect, given its origins. The technical decisions behind the game are, in places, genuinely unusual. According to documentation on the Bootleg Games wiki, special allowances were made for in-battle character sprites, with Cloud Strife's sprite combining 2 16x24 pixel images side by side rather than using the standard single sprite format. This was done to accommodate his oversized sword, and Barrett's gun arm received similar treatment. It is a small detail, but it speaks to the fact that someone working on this game was paying genuine attention to the source material and making real decisions about how to honour it within the constraints of the hardware. More unusual still is the game's approach to its text. Most Japanese NES and Famicom games used small 8x8 pixel hiragana or katakana fonts, and most Chinese Famiclone games used standard 16x16 pixel tile sets stored in dedicated memory pages. This game, by contrast, uses its own custom several hundred character 16x16 pixel monochrome font, which means the script data is scattered in chunks throughout the game's code, rather than stored in any conventional way. For anyone without a background in ROM hacking, the short version is simply this: the game is programmed strangely, and the cartridges it was sold on reflected that, being non-standard in their construction in ways that made them stand out even among the already eccentric world of Famiclone hardware. It blows my mind that this thing exists, but as impressive as it is, it's not without its significant flaws. Inconsistent enemy encounter rates mean that some areas feel relentless while others are almost suspiciously quiet. Battles have a tendency to drag, with enemy health pools that extend fights beyond the point of engagement. The difficulty is frequently unfair in ways that feel less like intentional challenge and more like incomplete balancing. These are criticisms that come up consistently among people who have played the Chinese original, and they are fair ones. For all its ambition, this is still a bootleg game built without official resources, and the rough edges show. Which is precisely why the ROM hacking community eventually got involved and improved things. So the insane story of Final Fantasy VII on the NES does not end with the Chinese release. Destructoid covered the account of a fan hacker operating under the username Lugia2009 who grew up playing and loving the original Final Fantasy VII. Their initial ambition had been to create their own 8-bit demake of the game for PC using RPG Maker 2000, a project they had been planning for some time. When they discovered that Shenzhen Nanjing had already produced exactly that in cartridge form, the plan changed entirely. Rather than starting from scratch, Lugia2009 decided to build on what already existed, improving and expanding the Chinese version into something that more faithfully represented the original PlayStation game. They began by learning to use an NES tile editor, which allowed them to modify the game's graphics. Early changes were modest, improving the sprites of playable characters and enemies, bringing them closer to their PlayStation counterparts. From there, they expanded into editing the game's music, its turn-based mechanics, and eventually just about any element of the game they wished to address. One of the most significant graphical changes involved the overhaul of assets that had been directly lifted from Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo. To make the demake feel more authentic, Lugia2009 worked by placing the original PlayStation renders side by side with their 8-bit tile work, adjusting each tile until it matched the source material as closely as the hardware allowed. Where the Chinese version had simply borrowed whatever was convenient, the fan version tried to reconstruct the actual look of the game that it was based on. And then there were the cutscenes. The original PlayStation Final Fantasy VII was defined in large by its cinematic presentation. The CG cutscenes were a genuine selling point of the game in 1997, a demonstration of what the hardware could do that left players genuinely astonished. Replicating anything of the sort on NES hardware was obviously not possible, and the Chinese version did not attempt to do so, shipping without cutscenes entirely. Lugia2009 added them anyway. Working pixel by pixel, they drew original 8-bit illustrated cutscenes to replace the cinematic sequences that the hardware could never have reproduced, giving the demake a narrative presentation that the Chinese original completely lacked. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary amount of additional creative work undertaken entirely out of love for the source material. The complete project, released under the title Final Fantasy VII Restoration, was finished and made publicly available in November 2013. The process had taken 4 years. 4 years of tile editing, music hacking, mechanical refinement, cutscene illustration, and collaborative work with other members of the fan hacking community, all in service of making a Chinese bootleg Famiclone game into the best possible version of itself. There is no other way to describe that level of dedication except as remarkable. The Chinese original is not a good game by any conventional standards. The balance is off, the encounters drag, and the difficulty spikes in ways that feel arbitrary rather than designed. If you go in expecting Final Fantasy VII, you will be disappointed and also slightly confused about the life choices that you made that led you there. But that is not really the right frame for a game like this. What this is, viewed in proper context, is a document. It is evidence of a very particular corner of gaming history, a moment when a small team of developers in Shenzhen looked at one of the most ambitious games ever made, a game spanning 3 CDs on 32-bit hardware, and decided they were going to fit it on a Famicom cartridge, gosh darn it! Not approximately or in name only, properly, with a world map, a Materia system, random encounters, and Cloud's oversized sword rendered across 2 sprites, because one was not enough. The fact that it exists at all is, in its own strange way, its own kind of tribute to how important Final Fantasy VII was. You do not bootleg things nobody wants. And the fact that Lugia 2009 then spent 4 years making it better, drawing cutscenes by hand and rebuilding sprite tiles, tile by tile, is a tribute to something else entirely. The depth of feeling that Final Fantasy VII has inspired in the people who grew up with it, and the lengths that love will go to when it has access to a tile editor and enough free time. I am Lady Arcade, and if you enjoyed this one, I have covered a lot of similar territory on this channel recently. The 8-bit Chinese version of A Link to the Past, the NES Demake of Super Mario World, and plenty more where that came from. Subscribe, click whichever video calls out to you on the end card, and I will see you all in the next one.